A U.S.-owned oil tanker targeted in the Strait of Hormuz, one of several attacked by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. The devastation caused to the vessels, which can hold up to hundreds of millions of dollars worth of crude.
Extract troops.
There's two components to this particular military entanglement that we're in. Component one is the accomplishment of all of the military objectives that the president, the secretary, the chairman have laid out. And we're familiar with those: destroy the...
3 Iranian F-14s did not need to sink the USS Gerald R. Ford to change the balance near Hormuz. They only needed 14 minutes. 14 minutes in which Washington stayed quiet, Tehran refused to blink, oil markets started moving before the Pentagon spoke, and one question became more dangerous than any missile on radar. Who sent those jets? Why did the carrier not answer first? And what was waiting beyond the strait if those 14 minutes turned into 15? Watch this closely, because the obvious story is a dogfight. The real story is a trap. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest shipping lane, but nearly 20% of the world's oil moves through it. That means every radar ping, every radio silence, every aircraft climbing out of Iranian airspace is not just a military signal. It is a price signal. It is a political signal. It is a warning to every capital from Riyadh to Beijing that one wrong move can turn a regional standoff into a global economic shock. And on this morning, the board looked simple. A U.S. supercarrier in international waters. Iranian aircraft approaching from the north. American destroyers screening the strike group. Drones watching from above. Satellites watching the drones. And somewhere behind the curtain, men in rooms without windows trying to decide whether this was a provocation, a mistake, or the opening move of something much larger. The USS Gerald R. Ford is not just a ship. It is a floating airbase, a political statement, and a 100,000-ton warning label. Its air wing can project power hundreds of miles inland. Its escorts can track aircraft, missiles, and small boats long before most people even know they exist. But here is the contradiction. Iran did not send its newest weapon. It sent an old one, the F-14 Tomcat, a relic from another age, a Cold War ghost. An American-built fighter Iran kept alive for decades through improvisation, cannibalized parts, hidden supply chains, and engineering obsession. That was the first message. Not strength, memory. At 6:41 local time, 3 F-14s lifted from Iranian territory and angled toward the Gulf. They were not moving like lost aircraft. They were not moving like a training flight. They were spaced deliberately. 1 forward, 2 behind. A triangle on radar. And aboard the Ford, that triangle created a question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Why 3? 1 jet can be a probe. 2 can be a warning. 3 looks like a formation designed to force a decision. At 92 nautical miles, the first American warning went out. No answer. At 77 nautical miles, a second warning. Still nothing. The carrier did not panic. Carrier strike groups do not panic. They calculate. They classify. They wait for confirmation because the first side to fire may win the minute and lose the world. That is why the silence mattered. Iran knew it. Washington knew it. And every second that passed made the Ford look either disciplined or trapped. At 63 nautical miles, U.S. aircraft were already moving. Not as a parade. Not as theater. As geometry. Interceptors lifting. Electronic warfare aircraft adjusting. Destroyers widening their radar picture. Commanders staring at screens where 3 symbols carried more weight than 3 aircraft should ever carry. Then came the first rehook. The Iranian jets were not headed straight for the carrier. They were bending. A shallow curve. Too subtle for headlines. Too deliberate for coincidence. That curve pointed not just toward the Ford, but toward the invisible line where American patience becomes American action. And that is where the hidden player entered the story. Not a jet. Not a ship. Oil. Before a missile launches, before a gun fires, before a president speaks, markets move on probability. Insurance rates for tankers react to risk. Shipping companies reroute on fear. Governments call emergency meetings before admitting they are worried. So when 3 old Iranian fighters moved toward the world's most advanced carrier, the battlefield was not only over water. It was in futures contracts. It was in energy ministries. It was inside every country that depends on the strait staying open while pretending it has alternatives. At 54 nautical miles, the Ford's escorts had enough data to classify the approach as hostile in behavior, even if not hostile in action. That distinction is everything. Hostile behavior means you prepare. Hostile action means you respond. Between those two phrases lives the most dangerous space in modern warfare. A gray zone. And Iran has spent years learning how to live there. Fast boats that swarm but do not fire. Drones that approach but do not strike. Militias that attack but deny. Missiles that move but remain unfired. Pressure without signature. Threat without admission. Chaos without ownership. But this time the pressure had wings. At 47 nautical miles, one Iranian F-14 dropped altitude. That was the second message. Low altitude makes radar tracking harder near sea clutter. It also makes pilots nervous, because aircraft that descend while approaching a carrier are not just posturing. They are changing the problem. A high aircraft is watched. A low aircraft is hunted. The Ford's Combat Information Center tightened. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the language of naval warfare, tightening means fewer assumptions and more permissions moving up the chain. The question was no longer, are they watching us? The question was, are they trying to make us shoot? Because if the Ford fired first, Tehran could claim America attacked Iranian aircraft near Iranian waters. If the Ford waited too long, Tehran could claim America could be pushed. Both outcomes were useful. Both were dangerous. And both depended on 14 minutes. At 6:48, 7 minutes into the approach, the US issued a sharper warning. Turn away. Identify yourself. Change course immediately. This time, there was a response. Not from the lead jet, from one of the trailing aircraft. Broken, brief, almost useless. A transmission just clear enough to prove someone heard, but vague enough to avoid responsibility. That was not communication. That was theater. And the audience was not the Ford. The audience was Tehran, Washington, Beijing, Moscow, Riyadh, the insurance markets, the oil traders, the commanders of every ship in that narrow corridor. The message was simple. Iran could still put American-made F-14s in the air and force the newest American carrier on Earth to calculate. That alone was a victory. But then the situation changed. At 6:50, the lead F-14 turned its nose 6 degrees closer to the Ford's projected path. 6 degrees. On a map, almost nothing. In a combat information center, everything. Because naval warfare is not about where something is. It is about where something will be in 90 seconds. And 90 seconds later, that lead jet would be inside a zone no commander wanted breached. The Ford had options. Too many options, which is sometimes worse than too few. Launch more aircraft. Jam communications. Illuminate with fire control radar. Move the carrier. Move the escorts. Hold. Warn again. Escalate. Do nothing. Every option told a story. And every story could start a war. Then came the delayed reveal that Tehran was counting on. The 3 F-14s were never the whole move. They were the spotlight. While every sensor watched the triangle in the sky, Iranian small craft began shifting patterns near the surface. Not attacking. Not swarming. Just moving. A handful here. A pair there. Enough to be noticed. Not enough to justify headlines. That was the chess move. Air pressure above. Maritime pressure below. Political pressure everywhere. The Ford was being asked to solve 3 crises at once: aircraft, boats, and narrative. And narrative was the most lethal of the 3. Because if a single Iranian jet went down, the image would travel faster than the facts. A burning aircraft. A grieving government. A speech. A vow. A parliament demanding retaliation. Proxies suddenly acting independently across the region. Lebanon. Iraq. Syria. Yemen. The Red Sea. American bases would go on alert before the wreckage cooled. That is why Washington stayed silent. Not because it was weak. Because the first official sentence from Washington could lock the crisis into a path no one could reverse. Silence, sometimes, is not hesitation. It is containment. But silence has a cost. At 6:52, the Iranian formation split. The lead aircraft continued forward. The 2 trailing jets widened outward, like a gate opening. Now the Ford faced a harder question. Was the lead jet bait? Were the trailing jets protecting it? Or was the formation trying to trigger multiple radar locks and overload the decision cycle? Watch the number. 3 aircraft, 14 minutes, 1 carrier, and possibly half a dozen governments waiting to see who blinked first. At 6:53, American interceptors moved into visible position. Not close enough to collide, close enough to be seen. That changed the psychology instantly. A radar warning is abstract. A fighter off your wing is personal. The Iranian lead jet held course. For several seconds, nothing happened. No turn, no climb, no answer. Just engines over water and men watching screens. Then the Ford's escorts took the next step. Fire control, illumination. Not a shot. A shadow of a shot. A way of saying, we see you, we can reach you, and the next sound may not be a warning. This is where wars often begin by accident. A pilot misreads a signal. A commander receives delayed information. A radar system interprets maneuver as attack. A politician hundreds of miles away demands firmness without seeing the seconds disappear. And in Hormuz, seconds are geography. At 6:54, the lead F-14 finally turned. Not away. Parallel. That was the most dangerous move yet. Because turning parallel kept the jet alive, kept the pressure on, and avoided giving the Americans a clean justification to fire. It was not retreat. It was refusal. The two trailing aircraft adjusted with it, forming a loose line that shadowed the strike group at distance. Now the 14-minute clock entered its final phase. The Ford had not fired. Iran had not turned back. Both sides could still claim control. Neither side had solved the crisis, and that is when the hidden purpose became clearer. This was not designed to defeat a carrier. That would be absurd. 3 aging F-14s cannot overpower a Ford-class strike group. They cannot sink it. They cannot survive a full engagement if the United States decides the fight has begun. But they can do something more useful. They can measure America's threshold. How close before warning? How long before intercept? What language does the Navy use? Which escort reacts first? How does the carrier reposition? How quickly do markets respond? How soon does Washington speak? That is intelligence, collected in daylight, paid for with risk, and possibly worth more than any missile fired. At 6:55, the first oil desks in Europe and Asia began reacting to rumors. Not confirmed reports. Not official statements. Rumors. That is the absurd power of Hormuz. A radar track becomes a whisper. A whisper becomes a premium. A premium becomes pressure on governments. And suddenly 3 aircraft have entered the global economy without crossing a border. At 6:56, the Iranian jets began a slow outward turn. Not a retreating dive. Not a panicked break. A controlled exit. The Ford's aircraft shadowed them, disciplined and cold, until the range widened. No missile launched. No aircraft fell. No explosion lit the water. And yet something had changed. Because the United States had been forced to show part of its crisis playbook, and Iran had shown it could still create a strategic event without firing a shot. That is the part most people miss. The absence of combat was not the absence of conflict. It was the conflict. 14 minutes of controlled danger. 14 minutes of testing. 14 minutes where the most powerful navy on earth had to weigh military dominance against political consequence. And Tehran got its answer. Washington would not be provoked easily, but Washington would respond visibly. That matters. Because the next move does not have to come from an F-14. It could come from a drone, a speedboat, a proxy rocket, a cyber attack on port systems, a tanker boarded at night, a mine found too late. That is how gray zone warfare works. The first event is not the war. It is the measurement before the war. By 7:01, the skies near the Ford looked calmer. But calm is deceptive in the Gulf. Below the surface, submarines listen. Above the clouds, satellites reposition. In command rooms, officers replay every second and mark every mistake. Why did the lead jet drop altitude? Why did the formation split? Why did the response come from the trailing aircraft? Why did the small boats shift at the same time? Coincidence is possible. In Hormuz, coincidence is usually a luxury. The next 72 hours became the real battlefield, not because missiles were guaranteed, because decisions were. The Ford could remain and signal resolve. It could shift position and signal caution. Washington could release footage and shape the narrative. Tehran could deny everything and let rumors do the work. Gulf states could quietly raise readiness. China could call for stability while calculating oil exposure. Russia could amplify the embarrassment angle. And markets could punish everyone before diplomats finished their sentences. This is why the 14-minute encounter mattered. It revealed the new shape of escalation. Not invasion. Not declaration. Not carrier battles like old war movies, but pressure events designed to produce political movement without crossing the line that allows a clean military answer. The Ford won the tactical exchange because it held control. Iran won a propaganda opportunity because it created the exchange. Oil traders won volatility, and the Strait lost certainty. At the 15-minute mark, if the lead F-14 had turned inward instead of parallel, the entire story could have changed. One radar lock, one missile launch, one pilot making one decision inside a cockpit older than many of the sailors tracking him. Then the world wakes up to a different headline. U.S. carrier fires near Hormuz. Iran vows response. Oil spikes. Bases on alert. Embassies warned. Proxy groups activated. And suddenly nobody remembers who moved first. They only remember who fired first. That is why no shot was the most important shot of the morning. The full picture is this. 3 Iranian F-14s did not challenge the Ford because Tehran believed it could win an air battle. They challenged it because Iran understands the value of making America choose between strength and restraint in public. A supercarrier is built to dominate combat. But Hormuz is not just combat. It is optics, economics, law, geography, pride, and timing compressed into a strip of water narrow enough to turn hesitation into strategy. The Ford sailed on. The Iranian jets went home. The official statements, if they came at all, would be careful, sterile, and incomplete. But inside the rooms that matter, nobody would call it routine. Because routine does not move aircraft, ships, markets, and governments in the same 14-minute window. Routine does not make commanders replay 6-degree turns. Routine does not force a carrier strike group to reveal how it thinks. And that is the real warning. The next crisis near Hormuz may not begin with a missile. It may begin with another old aircraft, another silent radio, another formation that looks too small to matter. Until it matters. Because the question now is no longer whether Iran can sink a U.S. carrier. The question is whether it can keep forcing America to defend one without starting the war everyone claims they do not want. And somewhere along that narrow waterway, the next clock is already running.